But we're talking about games we play, and we're not talking about necessarily those kinds of games. We're talking about games we play with relationships, and games like that are fun, and games like that are healthy, and we can have a lot of fun with that. But when it comes to our relationships, when we try to play games with our relationships, that is not healthy. And that's the reason for that is because when it comes to relationships, a game that requires a loser is a game nobody wins. A game that requires a loser, if you're in a relationship, if one of you wins and one of you loses, well, then that's not good for the relationship. Because when it comes to relationships, you want to win. Both of you want to win, and that's a healthy relationship. And so we started this idea last week, and we went through a lot of different a list of games that we play with one another in terms of games that are unhealthy. And so we went through this list, and so we're going to dive in today to one of those games. And the game we're going to look at today is the blame game. Now, I don't know if you are familiar with the blame game, if that's something you tend to play. I think most of us have played it at least once in our life. And when I think of the blame game, I'm reminded of a story my dad tells me. Now, I don't remember this story, but if it's not true, we'll just blame him, right? Anyway. But he tells this story of when we moved to North Carolina. We moved when I was a sophomore in high school, and basketball season rolled around, and basketball practice started, and I was meeting new teammates and things like that. And he says, I came home one day from practice and said, Dad, these guys are not catching my passes. Now, I was a fairly good, that was one of the skills that God has blessed me with in terms of basketball, and so they just weren't ready for it. They weren't used to it, and so they were not catching them, and apparently it frustrated me. And I came home one day and was complaining, and he just kind of encouraged me. He said, just keep it up, keep continuing, and eventually they'll get it. And so that was kind of a turning point for me, I think, because at some stage after that, I just took this approach that anytime I made a pass, if the guy didn't catch it, I said, okay, my fault. And I told him it was my fault, and I took responsibility for him not catching it, even if it was totally his fault, even if he should have had it. And so I just would take the blame, and I said, okay, my fault. And that just became something I incorporated into my basketball life, into my basketball game, in terms of taking responsibility for that. And while that was kind of natural and easy for me to do on the basketball court, it's not as easy to do in terms of relationships in life. Because in terms of the basketball court, it was not going to do me any good to blame the other people for not catching it. What was that going to do? How was that going to help? They were just going to feel even worse for not catching it, and then if I blamed them, they're going to feel even worse, and so that was not going to help anybody. And the same is true with relationships. Relationships in life, whether it's relationships in the home, at work, in the community, your friends, whoever it is, in terms of relationships, if we go blaming people, well, then that's not helpful. There's no benefit into that. In fact, when we blame other people for things, whatever it is, it doesn't close the relational gap, it widens the relational gap. And so, I don't know if you're like me, but that can creep into my relationships because I find it so easy to find a reason to blame other people for things. When things aren't going well, when something happens and there's consequences and things are not going the way I want them to or hope they went to, it's so easy for me to explain it away, to come up with a reason, to come up with an argument to blame someone else. I can always find a fault in someone else for what's going on. And some of you are like that too. We'll so easily find something wrong with someone else and to be able to blame them for the issue. But when we do that, it doesn't help. I mean, we can always find a reason. We can always blame our parents. We can always blame our kids. We can blame our teachers and coaches, and we can blame our bosses and coworkers, and we can always find somebody else to blame. But when we do that, it doesn't help the situation. I mean, think about it for a minute. Think about when somebody, when you're in a situation, you're in a relationship or something, and you get blamed for something. Whether it was your fault or not, you get blamed for something. How does that make you feel? Does it help you? Does it help you resolve the situation and be relationally closer to the person who's blaming you? No. In fact, most of the time, it creates an even further gap, an even wider gap in the relationship. And so if that's how you feel on that side of the blame, then when you're on the other side, think about how you're making the other person feel when you're trying to blame them for something. And so as we dive into this idea, this concept of the blame game, I want us to look at a story that happened with Moses and the Israelites. And I think it's helpful as we try to figure out how to deal with this idea of a blame game and how to figure out how not to play it. And so at this particular moment in history, Moses, as we talked about in our series, Here I Am, we talked about how God spoke to Moses from the burning bush, and he called and asked Moses, says, Moses, I got a plan for you. I want you to go back to Egypt, and I want you to rescue the Israelites. And so Moses said, okay, and he went back. He goes back to Egypt, and he gets the Israelites, and he takes them out of Egypt. Long story. I encourage you to read it for yourself. It's actually quite fascinating. But Moses brings the people out of Egypt. They get to the Red Sea, and now they're stuck. And then God parts the Red Sea, and they're through the Red Sea. Well, then God is bringing them into a land, into the promised land that he has for them. But when they get there, they get scared. At least some of them do. And so they end up wandering around the desert for 40 years. And as they end up wandering around the desert, they're about to be back into the promised land. They're about to now go and enter into the promised land. And that's where we pick up the story. It says, in the first month, the whole Israelite community arrived at the desert of Zin, and they stayed at Kadesh. So that's where they're at, all right? And it says there, Miriam died and was buried. Now, Miriam was Moses' sister. And so she's died, and so Moses is grieving through that, and so that may be some of what is playing into the situation that we're gonna get to in a moment. But he's grieving, and that's kind of where they are in the situation that they're in. It says, now there was no water for the community, and the people gathered in opposition to Moses and Aaron. So there's a problem that they're wandering in the desert. There's not a lot of water in the desert, in case you didn't know that, right? So not a lot of water, and so here they are, and they're going to gather together and against Moses and Aaron. It says they quarreled with Moses and said, if only we had died when our brothers fell dead before the Lord. That the situation was so bad that they thought, if it would have been better if we would have already died. That seems a little bit exaggeration, if you're asking me. If I was in that situation, I would not think I would have been better off dead. But anyway, so that's what they're saying, probably a little exaggeration. And so they say, why did you bring the Lord's community into the wilderness that we and our livestock should die here? And so they kind of play the God card, if you will. They didn't say, why did you bring us? They said, why did you bring the Lord's community? You know, those kinds of people that super spiritualize everything, that kind of seems like what they're doing here, kind of playing the God card, if you will. And so why did you bring us into the wilderness that we, and not only us, but our animals too? You know, they kind of throwing them in there, trying to make it worst case scenario, just trying to dump it all on Moses and Aaron, who are leading these people. And so there they are, just kind of bringing the whole situation down to them. And they say, why did you bring us up out of Egypt to this terrible, terrible place? I mean, this place, and it's not good here. There's no water. Why would you bring us here? Well, if you'll remember, that's not the plan. The plan was to bring them to the promised land, the land flowing with milk and honey, the land that is so luscious and just so good for them to live in. That was the plan. And the reason why they weren't there is because they had gotten scared. They decided not to trust God. And so the plan was never to bring them to that terrible place. And the plan wasn't finished either. They were still moving. They were still wandering. They were still going somewhere. And not only is this a terrible place, but they continue. They say it has no grain or figs or grapevines or pomegranates, and there is no water to drink. Remember, no water to drink, Moses. And so they're just going worst case scenario. And Moses and Aaron are sitting there, and so they're not quite sure what to do. And so when they're hearing all of these people dump all of this stuff on them, I mean, they're just, the Israelites are just blaming Moses and Aaron for everything. Why did you bring us out here? Now, as you read the story that Moses recounts, the story of the Israelites coming out of Egypt, well, that was so clearly God that did that. I mean, yes, God used Moses to do some things, but it was clear the way Moses describes the story, it was clear to him and to the Israelites that it was God that was bringing them out of Egypt. It was God that did all the plagues in Egypt. It was God that caused Pharaoh to let them go. It was God who parted the Red Sea. It was God who led them by a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. It was God who was leading them. And yet they say, hey Moses, why did you bring us out here? And isn't it true that sometimes when we're disappointed with God, we blame other people? When in fact, our disappointment, our frustration is actually with God? Moses and Aaron weren't sure what to do, and so they go, it says they went from the assembly to the entrance to the tent of meeting and fell face down. So they go to the tent of meeting. That's where they would go and meet with God, and they would go and have a conversation with him. And so they're not quite sure what to do with all the people and all the complaining and all of that. And so they're like, hey, let's go meet with God and ask him what to do. Which, by the way, is a good idea. If you're in any situation and you're not quite sure what to do, well, first thing to do would be to go ask God what he thinks. And so it says when they got there, it says, and the glory of the Lord appeared to them. So they go and God comes down and actually meets with Moses and Aaron and has a conversation with them. It says, the Lord said to Moses, take the staff, and you and your brother Aaron gather the assembly together. So Moses, take your staff and go. I want you to gather them together, and I got some stuff for you to do. And he says, go and gather them together. He says, speak to that rock before their eyes, and it will pour out its water. So Moses, I want you to go and gather them all together, and I want you to speak to the rock, and water will come out. That's how I'm going to provide for you. Because I know your needs. I know you're out of water. I'm going to provide for you. He says, you will bring water out of the rock for the community so they and their livestock can drink. Because remember, they were complaining about their animals as well. So their animals are there. And so not only are you going to have enough to drink, but you're going to have enough for your animals to drink. And so Moses took the staff from the Lord's presence just as he commanded him. So he takes the staff and he goes. And he and Aaron gathered the assembly together in front of the rock. And Moses said to them, Moses wasn't supposed to speak to them. Who was he supposed to speak to? The rock. And so Moses goes as God commanded him. He takes the staff and he and Aaron go and they gather the assembly in front of the rock. So he's doing all of that right. But then when he gathers the assembly, instead of speaking to the rock, he speaks to people. And he disobeys God. Fails to trust God in the moment. Moses gets frustrated and just says, listen, you rebels. He calls the people that he was supposed to lead and care for and love. You rebels, you people who are defying God, you people who are just out there complaining and complaining and complaining and blaming everybody else. What are you doing? You rebels, must we bring you water out of this rock? He's saying, must we, being him and Aaron, must we bring you water? Well, it's not him doing it. He knows that. But he's kind of putting himself in the place of God. Must we do this for you? Then Moses raised his arm and struck the rock twice with his staff. Instead of speaking to the rock, he speaks to the people, and then he takes the staff and strikes the rock twice. And even though Moses disobeyed God, even though Moses failed to trust God in the moment, this is what happened. This is water gushed out, and the community and their livestock drank. You see, sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes God provides even when we do the wrong thing. And that's called grace. And we love it when we get to experience the grace of God in the moment. And in this moment, God knew that this community of people needed water to drink. And because he loved them and cared for them and had a plan for them, he provided in this moment, even though they were complaining the whole time, even though Moses and Aaron failed to trust God in the moment, God decided to pour out his grace on them by giving them water from the rock. Because sometimes God provides even when we do the wrong thing. Now, Moses is not trying to tell us, as he's recalling this story, he's not trying to tell us, hey, doesn't matter what you do, God will provide anyway. He doesn't say, hey, you can just defy God all you want. You don't ever have to trust him. You don't ever have to obey him. That's not the point of the story, if that's what you're getting from what I'm saying. Moses says sometimes God pours out his grace and we don't deserve it, even when we do the wrong thing. And so because of that, the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, he's got a word for them because of what they have just done. He said, because you did not trust in me enough to honor me as holy in the sight of the Israelites, you will not bring this community into the land I give them. Because you didn't trust me in the moment, now you don't get to experience the life I had planned for you. You don't get to experience the abundant life. You don't get to experience the joy of leading these people into the promised land. You don't get to experience the joy of the purpose and the calling upon your life to do this because you failed to trust me. I mean, Moses had spent 40 years leading this people because one day I'm going to get to lead them into the promised land. One day I'm going to get to see all that. I'm going to experience the abundance and the grace and the mercy and the love of God and experience all of that land. One day I'm going to get to do that, so I'm going to put up with them for 40 years. And in one moment of distrust, one moment of failing to obey God, cost him the life, cost him what God had planned for him. And then, as if that's not enough, as Moses is reflecting on this experience, as he's trying to figure out what went on here, this is what he writes in Deuteronomy. He says this. He said, the Lord was angry with me because of you. He's talking to the Israelites. He says, the Lord was angry with me because of you. Is that not the blame game? He messed up. He distrusted God. He didn't obey God. And now he's blaming them for that. Well, he's just returning the favor because in the beginning, the Israelites were blaming Moses. And so this is blame game versus blame game here. And the Israelites are blaming Moses, and now Moses is blaming them. He says, the Lord was angry with me because of you, and he solemnly swore that I would not cross the Jordan and enter the good land the Lord your God is giving you as your inheritance. You guys still get to go even though you were blaming me. But I think it's your fault. I think you cost me this. And so here we have one group blaming another. A recipe for disaster. And so when it comes to consequences and when it comes to situations where blame can be had and divvied up and all of that, we need to ask the question, well, who's responsible? Or who do I blame? That's the question we're wanting to know. You know, Moses is wanting to know, well, who do I blame? Well, I'm not going to blame me. I didn't want to be here in the first place. So I find somebody else to blame. And the Israelites, they're like, Moses did it. Moses brought us out here. It's his fault. Even though they're really mad at God, they just blaming him. But when you and me, when we're in our situations, we want to find somebody else to blame because it's not our fault. It's always somebody else's. And so I found in life, there are kind of two types of people when it comes to relationships like this. When it comes to talking about the blame game, there's two types of people. There's the people who assign responsibility, and there's the people who assume responsibility. The people who assign responsibility, they're always out there figuring out a way to blame somebody else. They're always saying it's his fault or her fault or their fault or that situation or that circumstance or that social structure or whatever the case may be. And they're always assigning blame to other people. And then there are those who assume responsibility. They assume responsibility even when it's not their fault. Because this isn't assuming responsibility isn't an admission of guilt. Isn't an admission of hey, I actually am to blame. It actually was my fault. It's not that. It's we have a relational gap here, and we got to figure out how to close it. We got to figure out how to fix it. Because if all I do is assign blame, nothing's ever going to get better. Nothing's ever going to get fixed. Nothing's ever going to be made right. We're never going to be able to move forward if it's not fixed. And so the people who blame, it just nothing gets better. But the people who assume responsibility, well, those are the people who make a difference. Those are the people who enact change and close the relational gap and move things forward. And if you think about it out there, the best parents and the best people and the best leaders and the best teachers and the best coworkers and the best bosses out there, those are the people who assume responsibility. And after all, isn't that what Jesus did for us? I mean, he's sitting up in heaven and he's looking down at this mess that we've created, this mess of sin, and he looks down and he says, it's not my fault. I didn't do it. Why should I do something about it? But he didn't play the blame game. He looked down and said, there's a mess. And I'm going to assume responsibility. And he comes down and he wades into our mess and he assumes responsibility upon himself. The responsibility that, well, it was your fault and my fault. And aren't you grateful? Aren't you grateful that he didn't sit up in heaven and just blame? Aren't you grateful that he came down and assumed our responsibility? So if he's to be our example, why don't we just do that? Why don't we just look around and say, okay, instead of blaming them and blaming her and blaming, why don't we just assume responsibility? And when we assume responsibility, that's how we get rid of the blame game.